Thank you for listening to We Have Ways of Making You Talk. Sign up to our Patreon to receive bonus content, live streams, and our weekly newsletter with money off books and museum visits as well, plus early access to all live show tickets. That's patreon.com/wehaveways.
Hilton brings you new ways to stay, with experiences that let you capture the glory days. Introducing the Graduate Hotels. Each inspired by local college towns, these stays are always original and never boring. Get in touch with traditions all across the country and enjoy a stay that's a class above the rest. Book at Graduate Hotels with Hilton Honors Points at Hilton.com. It's a win-win. Hilton, for the stay.
Building a portfolio with Fidelity Basket Portfolios is kind of like making a sandwich. It's as simple as picking your stocks and ETFs, sort of like your meats and other toppings, and managing it as one big, juicy investment. Now that's pretty good. Learn more at Fidelity.com/baskets. Investing involves risk, including risk of loss. Fidelity Brokerage Services, LLC. Member NYSE SIPC.
Finding a new job is stressful. But with Indeed, it doesn't have to be. Just fill out your Indeed profile with your skills, experience, and desired salary. The more you fill out, the better your matches will be. And hearing from hiring managers will be 2 times more likely. Relax. That's your Indeed profile sending opportunities your way. Indeed, the world can work better.
Achtung! Welcome to We Have Ways of Making You Talk USA with me, Al Murray, James Holland and John McManus. The three amigos. Can we still say amigo in America, John? I don't know.
I think we're allowed for now, Al. I don't know. It's maybe pending, but for now, we're good, I think.
Okay, great. We've just done a sort of 8-part, although the 8th part of the 8 parts was 3 parts because we couldn't get it all.
There's just too many surrenders.
There's just too many surrenders.
Can't keep track of them all.
Yeah, we couldn't get all the meat in the sausage or the lid down on the pie. There's too many ingredients. So what we thought we'd do today is kind of wash up the end of the war, talk about the end of the war, cessation of hostilities in Northwest Europe, really. I mean, and also because it's a thing Jim and I have been talking about a lot lately, because we've been promoting our book, Victory 45. We've been talking about the fact that America is facing in 2 directions at this point in the war, kind of even more keenly than before, because they know one's about to end and they think they're kind of halfway through the other one. So let's talk about that, shall we? That's what we're going to do, isn't it, Jim?
Yeah, it is. I'm also, as you know, I've been doing quite a lot on the vision that Roosevelt had in the 30s and 40s about the post-war settlement and what the new war that was going to emerge out of war, what that was going to look like. And I'm quite interested to hear your take on it, to be perfectly honest. I think it'd be really interesting. So I'm talking about the good neighbor policy of the 1930s, treating Latin America, Mexico with friendship rather than aggressively. The 4 freedoms announced on his inauguration speech in March 1941, on his 3rd term, which obviously then morphs into the 8 points for the Atlantic Charter of August 1941. Then Bretton Woods and this idea of a sort of, a global economy based on free trade, low tariffs, Bretton Woods, all the rest of it. And then, of course, the Marshall Plan. I kind of think all of that is really, really interesting. And we talked about that a little bit with Antti Scaramucci the other day, but I'd be really interested to hear your take on it. And this notion that America during the war has a post-war vision. Does it or doesn't it? And what is that post-war vision?
Oh, it does. I mean, FDR really has been heavily influenced by Wilsonianism. I mean, he was part of the Wilson administration, and he sees that kind of America, an internationalist America. It's what he envisions for the future. He likes free trade, but he also has to be a little careful because he's very pro-labor union. And at that time, labor unions would have been a little bit more into protectionist policies because they're a little worried about competition from cheaper products overseas. All that said, he envisions a post-war world in which the United States will act in league with the Soviet Union to basically adjudicate disputes around the globe. Very idealistic. And, Jim, you mentioned the good neighbor policy. Yeah, so that's one way he's different than Wilson, who had the kind of the traditional kind of coercive policy. He occupies a portion of Mexico in 1914, and that really exacerbates some conflict along the border, as you might imagine. Roosevelt, one of the reasons why the Allies are in as good a shape as they're in is the Roosevelt administration in the late 1930s was forging very good relations with several South American countries and Central American countries so that we could have basing rights, and we were negating the Nazi influence there and the ethnic German communities and all that. So he envisioned a future in which we would get beyond the old dollar diplomacy and the kind of coercive Monroe Doctrine oriented policy to where we'd have like an interlocking network of I guess you could say, Western hemispheric states that looked out for one another's security. In the broader world, he envisioned a U.S.-Soviet partnership, and in that sense, he was, of course, far too idealistic.
I mean, I suppose that's why when, France falls in 1940, and there's the prospect of the French Navy falling into German hands, that will disrupt that entire picture in the Americas. So it's about his grand scheme as much as it is about immediate American security, isn't it?
Yeah, well, it is. And also looking beyond that, the concern that Britain might fall, too, later that summer, and that Hitler get his hands on the British fleet, and then we'd have serious problems.
And for all the sort of distaste for the British Empire, which I think lots of British listeners will think, well, hold on a minute, a lot of this is sort of a direction of travel is flavoured by a distaste for the British Empire, and the war presents an opportunity to break British global trade, which is America's great competitor, is that there is a global trading hegemon, and it's an opportunity to bring that to an end, or at least damage it. And the fact that the world ends up on the dollar at the end of the Second World War, and we wave goodbye to the pound, I think speaks to in a way, it's part of Roosevelt's genius, isn't it? He gets both things at once. So sell it to the anti-imperialists within American politics, because that's what they're getting. And he can also sell it the other direction, right? Oh, no, there's no question. And it's his main point of tension with Churchill, who, of course, we all know is an imperialist, and FDR is an ardent anti-imperialist who wants the end of not just the British Empire, but other colonial empires, including, by the way, our own. He fully intends to follow through on independence for the Philippines, which, of course, happens, even though he dies. And but he's also got this basically this dollar structure that'll be in place at Bretton Woods, which is, from an economic historian's point of view, this is just terrifically consequential and important. That from 1944 onward, the entire world monetary system is going to be structured around the dollar. And yet, interesting, the pound remains stronger to this day, in terms of value. So, score one for Britain on that sense, but in that sense. But yeah, I just think that's John, a very interesting moment. Yeah.
Just to rewind a moment, because what I think is really interesting is when he's talking about the 4 freedoms and when he's talking about the 8 freedoms that he outlines in the Atlantic Charter of August 41, there is an assumption there. America and the Allies are going to win the war, and this is what's going to happen after the war. So there's no real doubt about it. I would argue that there isn't really much doubt about it, actually, as it happens. By the time that America gets in the war, I don't think the outcome is in too much doubt, the eventual outcome. How it all plays out and how long it takes and all the rest of it. But do you think Roosevelt is convinced when America enters the war in December 1941 that America will end up on the winning side?
I think if we got him in a frank moment, he would say the probability is such that we will win. But I think he's way too involved in the nettling details at that moment and the crises that he has to manage, especially that first 6 months or so. Yeah. He's very worried about public morale. And I think it's easy to look back now and say, well, yeah, of course they were going to win. But in the moment when you just had Pearl Harbor, knockered and then you've had Singapore happen and then you've got the Philippines on top of it, I think there's a concern that the American people will kind of lose heart and say, oh, I don't know about this. And there's always concern for that will, in a I guess what we'll call a democracy. It's not really quite that. It's a representative republic. And there were, as we know, a lot of people within it who were kind of frozen out of participating on the basis of race or whatever. But, for the most part, public opinion does matter. Roosevelt has to worry about that. But I do think he's the kind of person who always has that big picture in mind. And he's working towards something and what he wants in the post-war world because, and I think this is really important to understand, he's experienced the whole debacle with Wilson. Over the League of Nations, over the 14 points. The disillusionment that set in after our involvement in World War One. He doesn't want to see that happen after World War II because he feels we just can't
should we
afford
just
that
very briefly explain that for people who don't know? So Roosevelt goes over with these 14 points. He goes over with this idea for a League of Nations. This is
Wilson goes over.
Wilson.
Global system. Yeah, Wilson. What did I just say?
Roosevelt.
Okay.
Yep.
Yeah. Wilson. President Wilson. This is the Treaty of Versailles in 1919. And he goes over there as Assistant Secretary of State of the Navy. And
FDR does, yes.
Yes,
exactly.
FDR does. And Wilson gets lukewarm response from his European partners and zero response from Congress back home.
Mm-hmm.
And American part in the League of Nations just sort of dwindles.
Oh, yeah. I mean, there's a tremendous disengagement and disillusionment. So there's a lot of layers to this. The 14 points seem to stand for an international world of free trade, the end of these kind of hardcore power broker kind of backroom diplomatic alliances and deals. It seemed to stand for self-determination, that any peoples who wanted their own independence were going to get it. And yes, this happens for Poland, but in part because the Polish people are able to fight for it. So when we see what happens with the Treaty of Versailles, this idea of punishing Germany, the reparations, Germany losing so much land and territory and its colonies and all that. And then we see who benefits from that, mainly Britain and France. So there's a lot of cynicism that sets in over this because Wilson had gone over there thinking, well, my gosh, the U.S. played a key role in the outcome and winning of this war. I ought to get exactly what I want. And also, too, this is unprecedented in American history for a sitting president to leave this country and to travel to Europe. I mean, now it happens all the time, but in those days, it was a very big deal. So here we are from the sort of narrow American perspective. It's here we are reaching out in the goodness of our magnanimous hearts to pull the Allied chestnuts out of the fire to help win this war. And then we're rebuffed. And so there's this kind of, what the hell with you kind of response. The U.S. pulls out of a mutual defense pact with France and Britain, which has terrible consequences for the future. The country basically goes what's often called isolationist, really means more like non-intervention because we're heavily involved in world affairs. It just depends what we're talking about. We're just disgusted with Europe. And of course, this then has great consequences for the future because we're largely disengaged, in the 20s and 30s when things go bad with the economy and Germany rises and all that. And there's a sense that we've been tricked into World War One, mainly by the British, and that we're not going to let that happen again. And so there's this profound reluctance. The other thing, too, there's a recession that follows World War One for about 2 years or so. And so because it's like, how are we going to reincorporate all these veterans back into the economy? How do we demobilize? And so there's that. And then there's this enormous regression in rights, because the government had been telling African Americans, participate in the war and there'll be more equality. It'll be the end of Jim Crow. And whites were basically saying, forget that. The Tulsa race riot, there's racial pogroms in Chicago and East St. Louis, all over the country, really. So it's this enormous retrenchment.
This is the time of the Ku Klux Klan and all that. And lynching.
The Klan rises dramatically in the 1920s. Here's a stat that'll blow your mind. Per capita, Klan membership was highest in the state of Indiana. At the height of it, 1 out of every 4 adult white males was a member of the Ku Klux Klan in the 1920s.
Wow. In Indiana?
In Indiana, a state that was on the Union side, the U.S. side, in the Civil War.
God.
Kind of tells you something, doesn't it?
Well, the thing that I always find amazing is that there was a lynching in Florida in 1934, which was attended by 20,000 people.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
1934.
And it went on. It continued on. The NAACP headquarters in New York used to basically have a display each day. They'd say someone was lynched today in Alabama. The head of the NAACP was a guy named Walter White, incredible guy. He had mixed race
What's
background.
the NAACP?
National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, which had been established earlier in the 20th century for that purpose, obviously, to push back against Jim Crow. And so Walter White, really interesting guy, because he, quote, looked white, so he could pass off as a white man, but he identified as a black person. And so he would travel in the South to these places where lynchings had happened, and he would talk to people like passing himself off as white, and he'd gather all this information, and he'd be kind of one step ahead of them before they figured out who he was, and that they could have killed him. And then he would go back to New York and he would publicize all this. And so it's one of the reasons why we even know anything about this, because the perpetrators usually didn't want it that well known in the long run. But anyway, FDR wanted to avoid all of that kind of toxic backlash in the aftermath of World War II. And he felt very strongly that the United States had to be involved internationally. Otherwise, horrible things would happen. And I think there was a great evidence to show that in terms of what happened with World War II, especially in Europe.
Yeah. Roosevelt's solution, as you say, you go through the Atlantic Charter, we end up on unconditional surrender, which I think is really, really interesting because it doesn't offer anyone points of disagreement, does it? You can't argue with it. You can't engage with it as the disgruntled party, can you? As the defeated party? Because after all, the problem with with Wilson's 14 points is they offer all sorts of points of disagreement, points to position yourself politically against, points of friction. You know, and after all, in Britain, what happens is, because it's the Liberal government that ratifies Versailles, essentially, in oppositional politics in this country, the Conservatives are against it, essentially, because they need a political position, don't they? And we have an oppositional system here. That added to the idea that Germany's been hard done by, which is an idea that people find almost irresistible, I think it's fair to say, then feeds into the to and fro of British oppositional politics. And then you end up with a Conservative government in charge, because after all, they're usually in charge. The Liberal Party collapses and dies after the First World War. And so the people in charge are people who don't like Versailles. In Britain, the people in charge in Britain are the people who don't like Versailles. And that then can only muddy the water in how you then deal with Germany, while Hitler's saying, all I'm trying to do is straighten out the Versailles Treaty. I'm just trying to bring about national self-determination, self-determination of peoples for my people who can possibly object. And I think what's really clever about Roosevelt just goes, no, it's unconditional surrender. And also what he's offering is points of principle rather than detail. And so you have a principled peace to come rather than one that goes, and by the way, that bit of Alsace-Lorraine belongs to him and that bit of Poland belongs to, what Stalin's
it's unequivocal, isn't it?
It's unequivocal. And Stalin's going to do that. Stalin in the East is going to rearrange the deck chairs, isn't he? He's going to, in fact, become probably Europe's most ardent nationalist as a consequence, because he decides who Poles are, he decides where Germans live, and creates these sort of mono-ethnic states where previously that bit of Middle Europa had been like a fruitcake with lots of different people in the recipe.
And so Roosevelt didn't want those loose ends hanging around, like a Treaty of Versailles kind of thing. He wanted absolutism, and I understand why he did. And also he invested great hopes in the United Nations, because the League of Nations had been a real terrible and profound disappointment. And one of the reasons why is the United States would not join as a full member because of this disillusionment that happens after World War I. And Wilson, of course, loses his health over this, campaigning for membership in the League of Nations, for Senate ratification. It doesn't happen. And so FDR is really concerned that you could see a repeat of that scenario. And Al, you're right. I mean, he has these large governing principles, like, the four freedoms and whatever else. And so he sees that as what's going to be our guidepost as we create the actual details. And here's where I think he was, somewhat naive, feeling that the Soviet Union would ever on any level represent those four freedoms or anything like it. But he believed that he could have a relationship with Joseph Stalin that would lead to good deal making as fellow anti-colonialists. What he didn't quite grasp is Joseph Stalin was an imperialist of a different stripe. I mean, so he was sort of blinded by ideology, I guess you could say.
Why did Roosevelt not read Stalin, or the Soviet Union for what it was?
I mean, there's been so many arguments over this among historians for so many years. I doubt I can bring much new insight beyond just, I think I don't know if you ever had this time where you're almost kind of fooling yourself and saying, okay, I can get along with this guy because I have to. There's no really alternative. I can't imagine the horrible consequence. But I mean, he'd also kind of done that from the start, because he had recognized the Soviet Union in 1933 without much in return, and allowed them then, in a way, to get away with terrible things in the 30s, including on our own citizens, many of whom had voluntarily moved there out of ideology or because of the Depression or jobs and end up in the gulags.
But do you think when the Soviet Union was on its knees in the sort of second half of 1941 and so very dependent on Allied supplies, and particularly US supplies, do you think he thinks, well, it's different now because we've materially helped them out. We've helped them out in this moment of crisis.
And they're going to owe us.
They know we're on the same side. We can work together despite our differences in a global order of which there's two types of his view, which is a sort of liberal democracy and free trade and all the rest of it. And then there's the Soviet authoritarian one, but actually they can coexist maybe.
Oh, there's no question. I think he thinks in the sort of negotiating dynamic, Lend-Lease will give us a lot of cachet with them and a lot of influence with them. I think he also feels his personal rapport with Joseph Stalin will help him do that too. And that was a little bit of a kind of affectation of the political left in this country, because those who were being honest with themselves knew what a monster the Soviet Union truly was, but not that many were being honest with themselves. And I think they were looking for ways to kind of justify this and to say, you know what, if things would go that bad, it's not because of Uncle Joe. He's got the right things in mind, and we have a rapport.
How far do you think Averell Harriman and George Kennan are key to this change of thinking? So Averell Harriman is a U.S. ambassador to Moscow. Kennan is, I think, the attaché. He's a senior kind of diplomat.
He's a Sovietologist too. Really, the leading
and he's a Sovietologist, and he's got the measure of the Soviet Union and Stalin in particular, right from the word go in a way that, arguably someone like Harry Hopkins, who is Roosevelt's best mate and his kind of sort of right-hand man, and he's a man who Roosevelt sends off on missions around the world, and because he can't, because of his illness and his polio and all the rest of it. And Harry Hopkins is this incredibly charming, very, very clever. He's a diplomat, isn't he? He's like a diplomat with no portfolio, but the kind of sort of Roosevelt's right man. So he has this very kind of sort of interesting and unique position. But you have all these other people that are sort of going off and doing all this stuff, and sort of personal envoy of the president, etc. Harriman, although he is this sort of scion of this sort of very well-to-do kind of East Coast family and is very wealthy in his own right and, is tall and good-looking and urbane and suave and all the rest of it, he gets a little bit shut out in the first part of the war. And it's only in the kind of second part of the war, once the kind of tide seems to have turned in the relationship with the Soviet Union, that his voice starts to be heard a bit more. But a lot of that comes down to Kennan, doesn't it?
Absolutely. So, let's deconstruct all three of these guys. Harry Hopkins was profoundly influential on FDR. So if you think of it this way, Harry Hopkins was to FDR what Henry Kissinger is to Nixon. The key person in a lot of different roles throughout a long administration. So Harry Hopkins had headed up the Works Progress Administration, which was a centerpiece New Deal program in the mid to late 1930s. And then, during World War II, like you said, Jim, he becomes FDR's key envoy. And especially to the Soviet Union, Harry Hopkins is very, very much a left-wing guy. And there's some people today who argue that he's almost like a Soviet asset or whatever. I can't necessarily confirm or deny. I don't know enough about that, but I can say that certainly he is in league with FDR's view that we can forge a relationship with Joe Stalin, that we can look the other way at their excesses, and that we can have a post-war world together. Now, he wasn't a well man either. He's in rotten shape physically, and he's physically
he's had half his guts cut out, hasn't he?
Exactly. It's amazing he lived as long as he did. Yeah, and you look at pictures of him. I mean, he just looks like hell.
He's thin and sickly and hollow eyes and all that kind of stuff.
He looks like a wind.
But he's very funny, isn't he? He's an amusing guy, and
he's charming.
Everyone loves him.
Funny.
Churchill loves him. All the British establishment love him.
Exactly. I mean, and I think he's a patriot too. I mean, look what he's doing for his country, traveling into like this as he does, and it's stressful. But Harriman and Kennan are cut from a different cloth. Harriman and Kennan have no scales before their eyes. They understand what the Soviet Union is. They understand who Joseph Stalin is, especially Kennan, who is really the leading Sovietologist in the State Department. And so they, like you said, I mean, they're getting more influence. As we see, we've had more problems with these guys by 1945. And they're going to then soon have a president who is much more in league with them, Harry Truman, who has no illusions either. And Averell Harriman actually was going to come back to Washington, and he's going to brief Truman. There's like the spring of 1945.
What he does on something like the 19th of April, literally just before Molotov turns up.
Right, exactly. And so he literally tells Truman, what you're looking at here, and he's talking about the Red Army, coming into Europe. You're looking at a barbarian invasion of Europe. That's what he says. And that's kind of what Truman wants to hear. And then Kennan famously, this is early 1946, sends his misdirect telegram.
Sends his missive, doesn't he? Yeah.
Yeah, and that really is quite influential for what becomes the containment policy. And Cannon envisions containment is not really quite military because he's a diplomat. So he's eventually an opponent of the Vietnam War, for instance, about a generation later. But he believes that we must stand up to the Soviets economically, politically, diplomatically at every turn, that they will test, they will prod, they will bully. And he's proven right, you know.
You have to stand up to bullies. Everyone knows that.
You do. Absolutely. That's the formula. And that's kind of what he's saying. But as a diplomat, I've always thought, and this is only my opinion, as a diplomat, he doesn't quite grasp what that eventually sometimes means, which is military conflict and war, if you're really going to take it seriously. And so but if I'm being kind to him as well, I'd say that he would argue in Vietnam that's not in our best interest to be there. That we can have containment without Vietnam. That's what he would argue at the time. Debatable, of course. But yeah, so those two voices are becoming more influential towards the end of the war. And Harriman, like you said, he's really connected. He's very connected in Democratic Party circles. You know, he's going to be governor in New York. He will later, speaking of Vietnam, be the Johnson administration's key envoy in the peace talks in 1968. So he has a long career.
Wow. I'll tell you what we should do. We should take a quick break. And then when we come back, let's talk about how the American military establishment are thinking about Japan, even as the war's ending in Europe. Because it's a thing Jim and I have been talking about a lot. And I think very, very interesting. Anyway, we'll see you in a tick.
This message is brought to you by Abercrombie Kids, where the activewear is made for every summer activity, so your mini-me can bring their personal best. Summer days are always an adventure. From day camp to rec leagues and pool days, Abercrombie Kids has the shorts, tees, and swim to keep them comfy and keep up with them. Get everything for the entire summer at Abercrombie Kids. Shop in-store, online, or in the app.
McCrispy strips are now at McDonald's. I hope you're ready for the most dippable chicken in McDonald's history. Dip it in all the sauces. Dip it in that hot sauce in your bag. Dip it in your McFlurry. Your dip is your business. McCrispy strips at McDonald's.
Hey, it's Bill Simmons from the Bill Simmons Podcast. The NBA playoffs are here, and Michelob Ultra is getting you closer to the game than ever with courtside seats and more. Enter now at MichelobUltra.com/courtside. Michelob Ultra Superior Access Courtside 2024 to 2025 sweepstakes. No purchase necessary. Open to U.S. residents 21 or older. Ends on July 1st, 2025. Multiple entry periods. Visit MichelobUltra.com/superior access/courtside for free entry deadlines and official rules. Message and data rates may apply. Void where prohibited.
Welcome back to Way of Ways of Making You Talk USA with me, Al Murray, James Holland and John McManus. I enticingly offered the listener the way that Japan looms over things in 1945. And I think this is something, I think it's something that kind of often gets overlooked because the war in the Pacific ends in August anyway, which isn't very long after May. Even in, Trump's latest thing, he calls VE Day Vitch Day, and he seems to have forgotten about the war against Japan in his
Right.
in his latest outburst. So, but the fact is, if you're the Pentagon, if you're George Marshall, you think that the war is 2 years, 3 years to go, right, in the Pacific?
That's a real possibility. Yes. It's a classic example, and we talk about this a lot, don't we? How you have to put yourself back at the time. We know how it turns out, and so we tend to kind of breeze over and say, well, the war is going to end in 3 months, and then we're all going to be back home, and it's going to be wonderful. Actually, if it's May 1945, I mean, we're in the middle of just horrifying battles with the Japanese at that point. The Battle of Luzon is ongoing. Eichelberger's incredible amphibious campaign to liberate much of the Philippines is happening. Okinawa is right at the sort of height of the battle. I mean, and then much less what's happening with our naval blockade of Japan, the fire bombings of Japan. And we don't know what the end game is going to be. And there's a lot of ways this could turn out. And this is another byproduct of something that I've tried to emphasize, especially this last year or so, that there's really no country that is fighting a global war on the scale that the U.S. is at that point, before or since. It's kind of a one-off in a way. And I think we tend to breeze past that and everything that means, all the pressures you have from this massive global war, and a country that, let's be honest, by spring and summer 1945 really wants to retool back to a civilian economy. It's tired of rationing already. And I know that elicits no sympathy from you guys in Britain, right? And it shouldn't. But the American people they want their luxuries. And They're kind of tired of this. So Marshall is looking ahead and like, what's it going to take? How are we going to have this end game here? That's the stress mode. And so many guys in Europe, too, who have fought in that war might have to be redeployed for maybe the invasion of Japan.
Well, there's two voices that completely influenced us, I think, Al. One of them is Tammy Davis-Biddle, brilliant academic, who's actually coming to We Have Waste Fest this year, and who's written a lot about the air war, but is doing a sort of magnum opus on the whole war at the moment. But she was the first one who I think in a conversation we had with her, Al, was pointing out that you have to look at Pforzheim and Würzburg and Dresden through the prism of the frustration the Allies have that the war is still ongoing when Germany is so clearly beaten. And there's other business still to be done in the Far East and the Pacific. And it's with, just give up and we'll stop bombing. We don't want to be doing this, but we need to hurry up because we need to save manpower because we're going to need it in the Pacific. So can you stop wasting everyone's time and just throw in the towel? And obviously bombing and obliterating cities is another means of avoiding infantrymen and guys in tanks having to go to the front line, into the firing line. So that is, one has to kind of look at the air war through that prism. And the second one is the book that you've been really looking at again, which is Hell to Pay.
Yeah. Yeah, which talks about the manpower shortages. Obviously armies always say they haven't got enough people. That's the default position of all militaries, isn't it? We could do with another 100,000 guys if that's right, but they're 800,000 people short or something at the turn of the year 44 to 45. You've got more people under arms than anyone else in the world, and you're still short because you're running these two gigantic. I think the other thing to remember is how enormous the Pacific is. Executing that war, how your logistic tail has to be that much more enormous because the distances involved has to be that much more peopled to get your point.
Well, yeah, just the time of shipping.
And time and everything, and absolutely everything. Yep. And I think what's also really, really interesting, and I think again we kind of forget because is that America is essentially an open society, so the newspapers are full of people complaining about how when's their husband coming home, when is their
true.
And anyway, we've heard that this tank is rubbish, and so why are you sending our boys somewhere with dud equipment, which is after all like a modern media newspaper trope. Newspapers love stories about dud weapons because it's a way of needling at the government. It's a bottomless pit as stories go. I mean, it's interesting because the Japanese, after all, are banking on fighting this, and some of this is tough talk, but how can you know that ever? If we lose 20 million people, then at least we'll have gone down in flames honorably. And, that's the way, that's a result that will satisfy us, actually. You think, what? But how do you know that's just tough talk?
Yeah, are they going to follow through?
Are they going to follow through? We don't know. And it looks like they might because of the way they've been fighting recently. And I think, and the Japanese, of course, do have enough access to American media, which is full of people saying, when's this bloody war going to end? Why am my husband's got kids. Why does he have to go? And all this stuff relentlessly in the papers. And a country that was isolationist 5 minutes ago, politically speaking. I mean, I think that's dawning on me more and more and more. Jim and I have been talking about Ike a lot this week. Ike's posture, I think, is that he's, well, all right, you've made us fight. Put us in a situation where we are going to have to finish this war for you. But we didn't want to be here in the first place, thanks very much. And that's why we're going to exact such a definite victory. And that's a product of isolationism, that attitude. That's a product of a country going, all right, you sod it. We're going to have to get involved, aren't we? And I think so much of that needs to be remembered that, we're looking at it now. Isolationism in America isn't some peculiar, it's a very strong flavor in a lot of American politics. And we can't pretend it comes and goes. It's ever present because after all, if you live in America, you left Europe. Your family, your ancestors left Europe at some point because they'd had enough of the bloody place, right? Yep. And the wars there and the restrictions there and the way of life there. So at this phase of the American, they are looking at maybe 2 years, maybe 3 years, and it being a complete nightmare. It being bloody and disastrous and a suicide pact with Japan in a way.
And as soon as you look at it through that prism, then you can understand the total impatience and frustration that they're experiencing combating the Germans in 1945, whether it be kind of bombing raids or whether it be, Eisenhower's refusal to look at Jodl and the total disbelief at that kind of absolutely absurd speech that Jodl does after the signing.
Oh, God.
Where he talks about, no one suffered more than us poor Germans and all this kind of stuff. I mean, it's risible.
So disgusted with that. Yeah, it's a great point. So in relation to the war in Europe, the attitude is certainly, like you guys said, with Eisenhower, with hundreds of thousands of soldiers, we don't want to be part of this mess. But now we're in it, and it's a job to be done. And once the job's done, we're going home. So, note to you guys, we are going home. We're getting out of here once it's done. We've pulled your chestnuts out of the fire. That's the mindset. In relation to the war in Asia Pacific, it's, you guys wanted to fight us? You wanted to attack us? Wow, are you going to get it now? And we are going to do what we are going to mete out to you, whatever we possibly can. Because there's a racial component to that, too. To build on Tammy's point, I mean, I think she's just dead on. And I would say further, that lens, that viewpoint comes from the fact that we are running out of manpower that we have immediately on hand. In other words, we have more, but that's going to take a political dimension to say, all right, now we're going to draft the 35-year-old with 3 kids to go send to go fight in the invasion of Japan. And like you said, Al, the people complain, why does my husband have to go? Why this? Why that? Or why isn't my husband come home? All of that is building. And so the Japanese really do have a lot to fight for in this last phase, because it's possible there could have been something short of unconditional surrender that preserves part of their empire, their presence in China. I don't know. A lot of things could happen. So FDR is wanting to hedge against all that. It's one of the reasons why he wants the Soviets in the war to take care of the possibility that the Japanese could continue on the war from China. And I know that seems weird, but we're concerned we could even take the home islands and there would just be this Japanese rump state continuing to fight in China. So there's all these scenarios that are playing out. It's very hard to manage it all, to figure out what the end game is going to be. And then on the margins, obviously, is this new weapon we have, the atomic bomb, and
which
how
goes
that's
to the
gonna come
margins
into play.
to the forefront in many ways, doesn't it?
It will be by summer once we know it's quite feasible. And that's Truman's problem more than FDR's, of course, famously. But so all of that is in play with a very messy situation. The other thing, too, like you said, too, Al, a great point, the vastness of it. When you look at the area of operations that comprise the war against Japan, that's a third of the world's surface of ocean, island, and continent. A third. Okay. So, I mean, think of operating there, all the shipping. Oh my gosh, it's staggering. So all of that has to be coordinated.
And that requires more people, which means a larger military. So the merchant marine, after all, is the biggest single slice, isn't it? I mean, it is really difficult, though, isn't it? Because, I mean, one of the things I think that's interesting is when people talk about the decision to say, to drop the atomic bomb, what they're actually trying to do is relitigate it. I often think it's about arguing against it. And usually, so many of our arguments come through the prism of mutually assured destruction, come through the prism of the politics of the Cold War and the war politics of the Cold War, what that would be and the justifications for the deterrent and all this stuff, rather than necessarily going back and trying to put yourself in the White House, after the Trinity test has been successful. After all, Truman comes away from Potsdam delighted that he's got an agreement from Stalin to enter the war in China. That, he writes his diary. Enough. I got what I wanted from Uncle Joe.
Exactly, because we're worried about what will happen with Japan and in China. I mean, and it's very easy to come along later and criticize that because, of course, it doesn't work out that well. But how are you going to know? Oh, well, the war will end the second week of August, and you won't necessarily have to have them there, and you've given them a gateway into Manchuria or whatever. Okay, but look at the time, and that's why I have pushed back for so long against this argument that dropping the atomic bomb was really about cowing the Soviets somehow or looking ahead to the...
Yeah, that's just nonsense.
It just doesn't really hold up evidentiary-wise, but also they're not thinking, oh, we have this bomb now. What's that going to mean for the Soviets? There's going to be a Cold War in 5 years, and they're thinking, how are we going to end this horrible war with Japan? And the morality of whether we should use the weapon or not. That's debatable, obviously. But they're thinking about how they are going to win this war and end it at the least possible cost and in the quickest time. And that's it. I mean, that's when you really look at the record at the time, that's what obsesses them as it would. They're living in the moment.
And after all, what they're then thinking is if this, I mean, there is a very interesting sort of thing where Marshall at one point is thinking about, well, maybe what we're going to have to do is use them as tactical weapons, the nuclear weapons, if we invade, and the idea that they're going to nuke the battlefield, then you're into a completely different global scenario that no one ever talks about imagining or as a possibly the events of 1945, do they? I mean, we get so hung up. I mean, I think it's very hard to do this, to try and put yourself there as the days tick by and the events come at you as they were.
It is.
I think it's very difficult to do that, but you really got to try and do it, I think.
You do. Otherwise, you just won't understand it. You'll see it through the lens of now.
Yeah.
And that's you're only going to get a very myopic view of it.
Yeah, and ending the war as quickly as possible for as few deaths on your side as you could possibly have.
That's what it's
because of all the things that you've experienced before. Because after all, we talk about the British steel not flesh attitude, which is articulated as such by British generals. That's as much to do with the British state not wanting a revolution as anything else.
Mm-hmm.
They've seen Germany collapse, the Soviet Union collapse into revolution in the First World War, Germany collapse into revolution in the First World War. They don't want one, thanks very much.
Of course not.
Yes, it's humanitarian, but it's keyed to direct political interests of the ruling class, if you want to frame it like that. But why not? I find it very hard to criticise.
No, because it's in everybody's interest, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, exactly.
I think it's good. I think anniversaries are useful though, because they give us, here we are. We've just had the 80th anniversary of the end of the war in Europe. We still got the 80th anniversary of BJ Day, but it does force you to kind of consider where we're at the moment and the legacy of the war and the tentacles. And there's that great line that Robert Harris said to us, Al, all those years ago when we had him on, and he said, when people say to me, "Why are you so obsessed with the Second World War?" And he always says, "Why wouldn't you be obsessed with the Second World War?" Obviously, hardly agree with that.
Yeah,
he's right.
But it is relevant. It is really important. And the tentacles of the Second World War, 80 years on, are still being felt very, very strongly, I would argue.
No question. Yep.
Weirdly, curiously, one of the lessons of history that we're talking about here, I think, is that events come at politicians, decision makers, leaders, thick and fast, and they have to parse them as the moment comes. You aren't in the bound volumes of a book that's being well argued by people many, many years later when you're living your life, are you? Well, and I think...
you're responding to what you see in front of you and what you think is going to happen in the future, but you don't know what's going to happen.
No.
Right.
Which is quite unlike what you'll read in a history book often enough.
Yes, it does.
Well, and the other thing they're worried about too, in terms of like what's right in front of you, what's going to happen to our POWs? How are we going to manage that? We know they're being horribly mistreated. Where are they? How are we going to get them back? I mean, that's just one thing that you'd have to worry about if you're FDR or Truman, among many, much less how you're going to end this thing.
That's such a good point. I hadn't really thought about that.
An unscrupulous enemy who will use them as bargaining chips.
Yeah. And so there's a lot of concern about that as we get into the summer of 45, that the Japanese are just going to simply kill all of them, and what that'll mean for our settlement with Japan, if we have one at all. And so that's a factor. What's going to happen with interned civilians, too? I mean, not just the military POWs. I mean, there's just so many balls in the air. And the other interesting dynamic, too, that we see in the American side, each of the services envisions an end game to the war through their own lens. So the Navy through a blockade and bombardment, the Army Air Forces, of course, through the firebombing and eventually atomic bombing of Japan. So a strategic bombing campaign. And, of course, the ground forces with the invasion of Japan. And it's going to kind of be all the above that's on the docket. And yet when none of us really wants to invade Japan, so how do we avoid that? And in a way, the atomic bomb and the Soviets entering becomes our kind of way out of that nightmare scenario, which would have been worse for the Japanese than anybody, honestly, as terrible as it would have been.
Yeah. Well, what a fabulous chat. It's always good to do these wash ups and chew the cud this way. I absolutely love it.
It's just fascinating.
Yeah. Thanks so much, John, for joining us.
We always need a bit of JMac on this.
We always need a bit of JMac. And of course, John is coming to We Have Ways Festival in September, aren't you, John?
I am. Just try and keep me away.
Brilliant.
Absolutely. I will be there.
Fantastic. 12th and 14th September for exactly this kind of war waffle cud chewing. We will see you all there, I'm sure. What was very interesting, John, is we did a book event last night and we said, how many of you, and there were about 100 people there, how many of you listened to the podcast? And so we had to do it the other way, and how many don't? So you end up with, out of 100 people, maybe a dozen hadn't listened to the podcast, but then only 4 of them had come to the festival. And you think, wow, there are so many more of these people to be
there are.
to be drawn like iron filings to our magnet.
Absolutely. Our empire can grow.
Exactly.
That's interesting.
Exactly. Anyway, well, it's so good to see you. Thanks, everybody, for listening. We will see you again soon. Cheerio.
Cheerio.
See ya.
Hi, this is Katty Kay from The Rest is Politics US.
And this is Anthony Scaramucci.
I've spent over 2 decades reporting from Washington. Presidents, well, they come and go. The chaos, that never changes.
And I've been inside the eye of the storm, 11 wild days in Trump's White House. I have seen how the sausage gets made and who's holding the knife.
Yeah, that's not a nice image. But on The Rest is Politics US, we break down the stories that are behind the headlines, and we actually look at what they mean to America and the rest of the world as well.
We're not just talking politics, we're talking about power.
We've got, both of us, access, experience, and just enough cynicism to know when something smells a little off and how to trace it back to the source.
No spin, no filter, reporting the stories you won't hear anywhere else.
If you want smart analysis, global context, and a front row seat to the world's loudest democracy, this is the show.
It's from 2 people that have ringside seats, occasionally center stage, in a country where court cases and campaign rallies share the same parking lot.
The Rest is Politics US. New episodes every week.